There were worlds in that age that had forgotten the shape of morning. On the hive sepulchre of Valtir, dawn was not an arrival of light but a scheduled diminishment of darkness, measured by decree, by liturgy, by the calibrated dimming of lumen towers whose ancient mechanisms had outlived the names of their makers. Above the black iron spires of the planet's capital necropolis, the sky was a wound of smoke and ash, veined with slow embers from the orbital wars. Below, 10 billion souls stirred within stacked catacombs of habitation, manufactories, shrines, ossuaries, and prison vaults, each level built upon the dead labor of another. It was said that the city had roots deeper than memory and towers taller than repentance. That day, no dawn came. At the hour when the first penitential bells should have trembled across the ash plains, the greatest bell in the hemisphere began to toll from the summit of the Basilica of Terminal Light. It was a bell so immense that its voice seemed less a sound than a pressure laid upon the bones. The strike of it moved through hab blocks, reliquary crypts, and cannon bastions alike, through chapel glass and armored hull, through old scars and unborn children. Its name, forgotten by the living and preserved only in forbidden inventories, had once meant mercy at the end of days. Now it rang without priest or chain. The first toll sent millions to their knees. The second opened hairline fractures in saint statues older than dynasties. The third turned every hound in the Undercities mute. By the seventh, the augur spires began reporting fire in low orbit. What descended from the void was not one ship but the ruin of many, fused in catastrophe. Fragments of war arks, pilgrim barges, troop coffers, shrine caravels, and iron monasteries had been driven together into a single blazing carcass, caught in the drag of the planet's gravity and pulled screaming from the upper dark. Its fall wrote a red scripture across the sky. Great plates of armor spun away in molten petals. Cathedral prows snapped from their keels. Engines, still burning from whatever hell had claimed them beyond sight, tore free one by one and plunged like suns. The city's defense cannons did not fire. Some claimed the machine choirs failed. Some claimed the gunners froze at their posts. Some whispered that the bell had forbidden resistance. But the oldest among the clergy, those who had read the sealed prophecies of the last siege, looked upward with their faces drained of blood and believed the hour-long promised had arrived at last. The carcass of the void wreck did not strike the central hive. It broke apart above the ash wastes beyond the pilgrim walls and came down across a desert of devotional statues, where generations of the poor had raised colossi from dustcrete and bone to honor saints who had never answered them. Limbs of broken gods collapsed beneath the impact. Halos 100 meters wide rolled across the plain like coins cast by a mocking hand. Flame rose in pillars. Shock waves traveled outward and flattened the processional roads. Across 40 leagues of ruined statuary, one fragment alone remained half intact, a blackened assault cradle, buried nose first in the slag and still hissing steam from split seams of brass. Around it lay the dead of its journey, armored zealots welded into their own plate, gunnery thralls without faces, choir serfs cooked inside silver masks, and stranger corpses besides, twisted by deaths that no anatomy manual of the Empire had ever described. All had perished in terror or fury. One had died standing. He tore himself from the wreck like a prisoner breaking through the ribs of a beast. The one who emerged was vast without being monstrous, bald, ash-pale beneath the cinders, and marked from scalp to heel by a red scarification that wound across his flesh, as though some ancient blade had once tried to write a sentence upon his body and failed. Ash and blood had hardened upon him until he seemed sculpted from war's own residue. Chains hung broken from his forearms, not ornamental, not ceremonial, but old instruments of burden or restraint, worn smooth by long use and longer hatred. In either hand he carried an axe haft, though no blade crowned it, only a splintered socket black with divine-looking fire. He stood amid the wreckage and did not kneel. Around him the ash plain smoldered. Far overhead, the remains of ships still fell in silence between the tolls of the Basilica bell. He looked not at the city first, nor at the statues shattered around him, but at the sky as if searching the smoke for something that had escaped him. The expression on his face was not wonder, nor fear, nor even grief in its common mortal shape. It was the gaze of one who had crossed too many endings to mistake another for anything holy. From the city walls, the first armored processions were already advancing. They came in ordered ranks beneath banners of flayed scripture and bronze suns. Penitent engines strode with iron censers swinging beneath their torsos, trailing incense thick as battlefield fog. Choir priests in sealed respirators chanted target liturgies. Confessors with shock pikes marched beside censer bearers and relic gunners. At their center rode Lord Provost Caldrake, warden of the Ninth Gate, in a tracked command shrine plated with the finger bones of martyrs. He had been ordered to seize whatever had fallen. If it resisted, he was to declare it a sign and burn it as one. Yet before the columns reached the wreck field, something older than command had already moved among them. The bell from the Basilica of Terminal Light rang an eighth time. Every helm receiver in the warden's convoy erupted with static and whispered prayer. The engine servitors began to weep lubricants from their eye lenses. 3 relic gunners turned their muzzles toward the sky and opened fire at nothing any human eye could see. On the ash plain, the giant stranger lowered his head, as if listening to a voice buried beneath the sound. He heard no words. He heard pain. Not mortal pain alone, though that was everywhere. Beneath the bell and the engines and the far artillery thunder of a dying orbit, there ran another sound, vast and layered, like continents grinding their teeth in sleep. It came from no direction the senses could name. It was behind the world, beneath thought, older than language and younger than terror. In that buried cry there was hunger, triumph, invitation, and an ecstasy so cruel it had learned to call itself destiny. The stranger's hands tightened on the broken haft until the wood cracked. Then, for the first time since clawing his way from the assault cradle, he spoke. The words were not in the tongue of Valtyr, nor any courtly dialect of the Empire, yet every soul upon that plain understood the intent of them, for some declarations require no translation when uttered by a being who has long since exhausted every lesser vow. Show me the gods. The wind changed. Ash, that had drifted downward now rose in spirals, circling him without touch. Across the wreck field, the dead chained at their stations began to twitch inside fused armor. The bell ceased mid-toll, not by ending, but by being cut short, as if a hand larger than the tower itself had closed around its throat. From the open wound of the ruined cradle behind him, where darkness pooled too deeply for mere shadow, a child's voice emerged and said, with perfect calm, that he had come too late for dawn and too early for the end. When he turned, there was no child there, only a pair of sightless eyes shining for an instant in the black, and beyond them the sense of something waiting that had watched his fall with ancient patience. They came to the wreck field beneath icons of judgment. The soldiery of Valtyr advanced in ordered severity, their ash cloaks snapping in the hot wind, their iron masks shaped into expressions of eternal accusation. Above them rolled the tracked shrine of Lord Provost Caldrake, whose turrets bore censers instead of banners, and whose armored flanks were scored with 1,000 votive cuts made by pilgrims seeking absolution through touch. Around the shrine walked confessors in black plate, dragging hooked staffs across the slag so that sparks followed them like captive fireflies. Behind them strode the penitent engines, towering frames of piston and chain, within whose cages emaciated martyrs hung awake and praying, their agony fed into the machines as motive force. No one spoke of the bell. No one dared. It had ceased in mid-toll, and in the silence left behind each man heard his own breathing with dreadful intimacy, as if some immense listener had leaned close to the world. The choir priests murmured encrypted litanies into their vox grills. The relic gunners tightened gloved hands upon sanctified triggers. The warden's convoy rolled forward over broken halos and the shattered faces of stone saints, toward the lone figure standing beside the half-buried cradle of blackened metal. He had not moved far. Ash wound around him in slow gyres, rising where it should have settled, as though the plane itself exhaled in his presence. He seemed neither living nor spectral, but some harder condition between the two, the residue of wars too old for record. The broken haft in his hand was now strapped across his back beside the other. Both sockets were empty of blades, yet every soldier who looked upon them felt, with the force of instinct, that they had once devoured things no forge of Valtir could name. At 50 paces, Lord Provost Caldrake raised one gauntleted hand. The column halted as one body. Steam sighed from the shrine's vents. Incense rolled low over the ground, thick with myrrh, machine oil, and the sweet rot used in funerary rites for high-ranking clerics. Caldrake rose within the open command pulpit, his robe of office hanging over his armor in layers of soot-black scripture. The lenses of his helm glowed a severe amber. When he spoke, amplifiers hidden in the shrine's reliquary stacks gave his voice the sonority of a mausoleum. "Cast down your weapons, unknown one, and receive the mercy of examination. By the authority of the ninth gate, by the writ of the grave synod, by the vigilance of the throne entombed, I bind this field in covenant and command. State your nature." The giant stranger regarded him without haste. His eyes were dark, but there was no vacancy in them. Rather, they held too much wakefulness, the way a battlefield at dusk still holds the memory of screams after the bodies have gone still. "I am no one's subject," he said. The words were plain. Their force was not. Many had defied the authority of Valtir and perished for it. Heretics, insurrectionists, starving pilgrims, rebels from the sump deeps, even schismatic generals whose regiments had turned their guns against the tithe fleets. All had spoken with some admixture of desperation, pride, madness, or hope. This voice bore none of those. It did not rise in challenge, it did not plead. It simply denied the right of command, as a mountain might deny a prayer. Caldrake's silence lengthened by a heartbeat too many. Then, with ritual precision, he unsealed the scroll case attached to the pulpit rail and withdrew a strip of treated skin inscribed with censure formulas. It unfurled down the front of the shrine, brushing the ground. The confessors lowered their hooked staffs in unison. The choir priests began a harmony pitched beneath normal hearing, felt rather than heard, a pressure under the skin. "In every age," Caldrake intoned, "the adversary enters clothed in singularity. It rejects title, lineage, and doctrine so that the weak may mistake emptiness for purity. But there is no namelessness before the throne. All things are catalogued in ash, and all wandering ends in iron." He lifted the strip of skin and began the sermon of seizure, an oration older than the hive itself, first composed for the binding of sky demons during the siege of Hollow Mercury. Each verse named a category of blasphemy. Each response from the confessors sealed one avenue of metaphysical escape. The doctrine was a net woven from theology and fear. It had broken witches. It had silenced living relics. Once, if the chronicles spoke true, it had made an angel kneel until its bones showed through its wings. The stranger listened as if to weather. Yet not all listeners on that plain heard only the sermon. Among the warden's retinue marched a child, though no child should have been there. She wore the grey sackcloth of an ossuary novice and walked barefoot over the hot slag without injury. Blindfolds of funeral linen covered her eyes, but she neither stumbled nor reached for aid. No order had summoned her, no guard had admitted her. She had simply appeared in the column after the bell's 8th toll, and because terror had already thinned the reason of many men, none had dared lay hand upon her. The priest glanced at her, and then away, as men glance away from eclipses. She stopped now beside the foremost penitent engine, and tilted her veiled face toward the giant. "He does not hear your sermon," she said softly. Her voice passed through the ritual harmonics like a pin through silk. The choir priests faltered. One dropped to his knees, blood leaking from both ears. Caldrake turned with such violence that the shrine's servos snarled. "Remove her." No one moved. The child lifted one small hand and pointed not at the stranger but at the wound of darkness within the buried cradle behind him. "It is speaking again," she said. "It speaks in the spaces between your holy words, Lord Provost. It says your scriptures are made from doors. For the first time that day, fear entered Caldrake's voice nakedly. Silence her. A confessor advanced at last, shock pike lowered, more to prove obedience than courage. He came within 3 paces of the child. Then the dead in the wreck field rose. Not all, not even many, but enough. Armored corpses fused into their harnesses lurched upright amid the scattered debris. Gunnery thralls with blackened mouths dragged themselves from the ash. One headless body in scorched vestments took 3 steps before collapsing again. They did not attack. They merely stood, turning as if in attendance upon some unspoken liturgy. From every ruined throat came the same sound, a dry inhalation, as though the field itself had decided to draw breath through them. The confessor backed away. The sermon fractured. Relic guns swung toward the risen dead, toward the child, toward the giant, then toward one another as training warred with panic. Through it all, the stranger remained still. Omniscience would later record that this stillness was not uncertainty but judgment. He had seen worlds where priests flayed cities into obedience, and worlds where faith was the last torch held against impossible night. He had learned the equal cruelty of gods and the mortals who adored them. In Caldrake he saw not villainy in its purest form, but something older and sadder, a man who had mistaken endurance for sanctity and law for truth, because to question either would have broken him. The child turned her bandaged eyes toward the giant as if she saw him perfectly. "If you enter the city," she asked, "will you kill only the gods?" He looked past her to the towers of Valtir, their spires disappearing into the smoke-dark sky, and to the billion shrines built one atop another like the vertebrae of a dead colossus. He saw the empire's wounds, and the fervor crusted over them. He saw the thinness of the walls men built between devotion and atrocity. Most of all, he heard beneath the world that vast hidden cry patient as famine. "No," he said. The answer spread across the plain like winter. Before Caldrake could command fire, the buried cradle behind the stranger split wider with a groan like a tomb opening under the sea, and from its black interior there issued a wind that smelled of temples, battlefields, plague, pits, and funeral pyres all at once, as though every manner in which men had ever made meaning from suffering had been ground together and given breath. The wind from the split cradle struck the wreck field like the exhalation of a buried age. Incense was torn from the censers and scattered. Prayer scrolls ripped free of gauntlets and spun upward in frantic spirals before blackening at the edges. The risen dead, which had stood in mute attendance, lifted their ruined faces into that breath as flowers turn toward a sun they cannot survive. Across the line of Valtir's soldiery, targeting rites collapsed into panic. Some fired at shadows, some fired at the corpses. One relic gunner turned his sanctified barrel upon his own chest and loosed a shot that burst him in a rain of iron teeth and steaming blood. Lord Provost Caldrake gave the order at last. "Burn all of it." The penitent engines answered first. Their martyr cages shook with renewed torment as hidden needles plunged deeper into the flesh of the living saints bound within. Steam screamed through pipes. Hydraulic limbs rose, ending in maces shaped like closed scripture seals. The engines advanced, each step pounding broken halos deeper into the ash. The giant moved before the order had finished echoing. There was no flourish to it, no warrior's display. Motion simply overtook stillness. One instant he stood amid the gyres of ash, and in the next the foremost penitent engine's knee had come apart in a burst of fractured pistons and shrieking metal. He had seized a fallen slab of wreckage, half melted and jagged, and driven it through the joint with such force that the machine folded sideways like a kneeling idol. Its cage split on impact. The emaciated martyr inside, still wired to the engine's nerves, looked once upon his destroyer with wet, disbelieving gratitude before the convulsion of severed cables killed him. The second engine swung its mace. The giant caught the descending head on one forearm. Bone should have broken, flesh should have pulped. Instead there came a sound like stone struck against an older stone. He twisted, tore the weapon loose by its chain, and brought it upward into the engine's faceplate. bronze shattered. The pilot, within an old confessor bolted into the torso cavity up to the ribs, had time only to widen his eyes before the next blow drove him backward through his own sanctum. Around them, the field became a liturgy of disobedience. Coldrake's soldiers loosed disciplined volleys, but discipline dissolved the nearer it came to him. Shots struck wreckage that had not been there a moment before. Ash thickened into veils. The dead, neither loyal nor free, wandered between firing lines and broke their formations with the simple accusation of their continued existence. Men began to shriek that the statues were turning to watch. A choir priest tore off his respirator because he was certain something in the filters had learned his true name. Through all of it, the blind child walked untouched. She passed between shell bursts and collapsing metal as if traversing a garden path. The linen over her eyes fluttered in the hot gusts, but her face remained calm, almost mournful. When one relic gunner stumbled into her path and raised his weapon in blind reflex, she laid her hand upon the barrel. Frost spread instantly across the sanctified iron. The mechanism locked. The man fell backward, clutching his chest, whispering that he could hear bells beneath his ribs. The giant did not look to see whether she followed, yet he angled his path toward the city's pilgrim walls, through the collapsing edge of the warden's line, and she came after him with the surety of one returning to a place long abandoned, not discovering it for the first time. Lord Provost Coldrake, seeing command slipping from his hands like blood through prayer beads, descended from his shrine. He drew the execution blade chained at his hip, a long, black weapon whose fuller was packed with funeral ash from 100 consecrated pyres. He was no ceremonial lord. He had taken heads in the under-rebellions and carved verdicts into armored flesh. Rage now gave him the clarity that fear had denied. He came at the stranger with the desperation of a man defending not only office, but cosmology. The first clash rang across the plain. Coldrake's blade bit the broken haft strapped across the giant's forearm, shaving sparks. The second stroke aimed for the throat. The giant turned aside and struck with the heel of his hand. The blow shattered Coldrake's breastplate sigils and flung him into the side of his own command shrine. Bone cracked beneath iron. The warden fell to one knee, helm half-caved, blood filling the amber glow of one lens. Still he tried to rise. The giant looked down at him, and for an instant, the whole battlefield seemed to hold still around that gaze. Coldrake had expected hatred. He found something colder, recognition without respect, pity without softness. "You built this cage," the warden rasped through blood. "You call it false because you were not placed above it." The giant answered by taking the execution blade from his hand and snapping it across his knee. Then he left him living. This was the greater humiliation, and Coldrake knew it. He watched through the ruin of his helm as the giant and the blind child passed beyond the broken line and approached the pilgrim walls, where panic had already spread ahead of them like oil fire. He tried to command pursuit, but his own officers recoiled from him as from an omen. Behind them, the wrecked cradle continued to groan in the ash, its darkness widening, and no one on that field wished to turn their back upon it. The walls of Valtir did not bar the way. By ancient right, the pilgrim gates were never fully sealed. Between their armored leaves lay ingress channels through which the dying, the penitent, the dispossessed, and the debt-bound had for centuries passed inward to seek labor, absolution, or consumption by the city. Into one of these channels the giant descended, beneath archways carved with scenes of martyrdom so weathered that suffering itself had become featureless. The air changed with every step. Ash gave way to dust, dust to chill, chill to the mineral damp of buried stone. The blind child moved ahead now, her bare feet silent on the descending stair. Behind them the tumult of the battlefield faded, replaced by the groan of ancient structures bearing impossible weight. "Who are you?" the giant asked. The child's answer came at once, as if she had been listening for that question since before he fell from the sky. "They named me Ione when I was born in the bone wards. Later they named me Saint because I did not die when I should have. Then they covered my eyes, because I kept telling them what watched from behind the altar." She did not boast. She recited. They went downward through a procession of catacombs vast enough to seem like inverted cities. Tier upon tier of skull niches disappeared into dark. Reliquary bridges spanned chasms filled not with water, but with bones, ground smooth by time and the constant settling of the dead. Here and there, votive candles burned before femur pillars and vertebrae arches. The whole abyss glimmered faintly, as if lit by memory rather than flame. This was the ossuary sea, on which the foundations of Valtir had been laid. No census knew how many dead lay there. Conquerors, plague hosts, pilgrims, labor serfs, child martyrs, cardinals, failed prophets, stillborn heirs, unnumbered generations compacted into a pale, shifting continent beneath the living city. The empire above called it holy support. The poor called it the place where even names became weight. Ione stopped upon a narrow bridge of rib-bone stone and turned her bandaged face toward the depths. "Listen," she said. The giant listened. At first there was only the settling murmur of the ossuary beneath them, the minute, endless collapse of old remains under the pressure of more. Then another sound emerged from beneath it, not speech, but a choir of unfinished cries, layered so densely that they formed a near music, vast and grief-stricken. It came from everywhere in the catacombs at once. Not the dead, he understood. Something had fed upon the shape of their fear for so long that it had learned to echo them perfectly. The Red King, the Silk Sovereign, the Laughing Gardener, the Keeper of Mirrors, Ione whispered. They are masks, wounds-grown faces, mouths around one hunger. For the first time since his descent from the burning void, uncertainty touched him. He had crossed realms, butchered divinities, and watched heavens come apart under his hands. Yet here, beneath a city rotting under prayer, the truth seemed not larger than he had imagined but more intimate, and therefore more terrible. Not gods descending upon mankind. Not mankind merely seduced upward toward gods. Something interwoven, a pact so old neither side remembered which had first opened the door. Far below, in the white immensity of the ossuary sea, a path began to appear where no path had been, bones shifting aside in a long, slow curve as though some unseen pilgrim walked before them toward the heart of the underworld. Ione reached for his hand. "It knows you are here now," she said. And from the depths, where no breath should have endured, there rose the sound of a single vast inhalation, patient and expectant, as if the catacombs themselves had begun to wake. The path of bones descended in a curve too deliberate for chance. Before the red pilgrim and the blind saint, the ossuary sea parted by increments, tibias rolling aside, skulls tipping into pale drifts, vertebrae settling with the dry murmur of old prayer beads slipping through dead fingers. Nothing visible moved them. No hand emerged from the depths. Yet the way opened with the grave patience of a ritual begun long before either traveler had drawn breath. Above them, Valtir still roared in panic. Far overhead, through stone older than dynasties, the city's alarms and battle sirens trembled like weather. But deeper down, beneath the architecture of empire and the weight of its innumerable dead, another order prevailed. The air grew warmer. A scent entered it, not rot, not incense, but the metallic savor of fresh blood struck by heat. Ione stopped only once. She knelt beside a half-buried skull whose brow had been branded with the seal of some forgotten penitential order. Her bandaged eyes turned toward it, and her small hand hovered over the ancient mark without touching. "This one died believing obedience would spare his sons," she said. "The sons were conscripted the next day." Then she rose and continued downward without mourning, as though grief was too common in that place to merit ceremony. The red pilgrim followed in silence. The broken hafts on his back knocked softly against one another with every step. He had walked roads of fire, climbed mountains built from the dead, crossed palaces where eternity itself had grown diseased. But there was something distinct in the underworld beneath Valtir. Here, suffering had not been exalted into grandeur. It had been stored, tallied, mortared into the foundations. The empire above had not conquered pain, it had engineered permanence from it. The path ended at a gate. It was not wrought of metal or carved stone. Rather, it seemed a rent in the catacomb itself, a tear in the shape of an archway, through which no masonry could be seen, only a red glare, breathing like a furnace behind a veil. Along the torn edges of reality hung chains, the thickness of ship hawsers, each link embossed with the images of men killing brothers, sons killing fathers, empires devouring their own frontier worlds. The images changed when looked at too long. Faces shifted. Victors became butchered dead. Martyrs sprouted crowns of iron. Kings went to war wearing their own skulls. Ione did not enter. "This is the first wound," she said. "One mouth of the thing that wore many names." The pilgrim looked into the red glare. Already it was familiar, not because he had seen that exact place, but because all realms shaped by slaughter eventually learned the same geometry. Space there did not extend. It assaulted. Distance existed only to be closed by violence. Time only to count the beats between wounds. "When I pass through," he said, "do not follow." Ione's face remained still beneath the linen. "If you fail, it will learn your shape. If you triumph, it will learn your hunger." He gave no answer. He stepped beneath the chains and entered the wound. The world on the other side had no sky, only a vault of brass plates hammered together over eternity, glowing from the heat behind them. The seams between the plates leaked a red radiance like sunset seen through fresh cuts. The ground was not earth, but iron filings soaked dark and packed hard by the trampling of armies without number. Everywhere rose fortresses, battlements, siege towers, and citadels piled upon older ruins, all forged in one merciless design: angles of assault, terraces of execution, parapets lined with impaled standards made from spinal columns and flensed banners. Rivers of molten ore wound between the strongholds. Their spray hissed like breath on open meat. The realm was at war with itself in every direction. Hosts in armor of crimson scale crashed against hosts in armor of blackened bronze. Giants with horned helms split ranked infantry from throat to groin. Hounds the size of troop carriers tore men in half and flung the pieces into shield walls. Catapults hurled cages full of screaming captives, which burst in midair and rained blades instead of bodies. Yet no strategy governed it. No city was defended for value, no line held for terrain. Conquest there was not toward an end. It was the end, remade each instant so it could continue. The Red Pilgrim walked through the slaughter, and the slaughter noticed him. At first it came as a tremor in the nearest ranks. Warriors turned mid-kill, nostrils flaring behind visor grills. Hounds lifted blood-lacquered heads and whined low in their throats. Then a cry rose from tower to trench, from war engine to corpse mound, one sound in 1,000 mouths, not a word, but recognition of an intruder who had not arrived as prey. They came at him in waves. The first rank bore hooked glaives and rectangular shields of hammered skull metal. He tore the lead warrior's weapon free, broke the shaft across a second's helm, and drove the jagged half into a third's eye slit. The shield wall buckled. He seized one by the throat, used the body as a bludgeon until both corpse and those struck by it ceased to possess human outlines, then hurled what remained into the next press. The realm answered with greater ferocity, as if pleased. A hound lunged. He met it in the air, one hand crushing its lower jaw, the other wrenching back its upper skull until vertebrae snapped like wet branches. A spear of black bronze entered his side to the haft. He broke it off inside himself and drove the splintered point through the spearman's mouth. 3 axe-bearers fell upon his back. He rolled beneath them, came up with one in each hand, and dashed their skulls together with such force that the third stumbled blind in the spray. But numbers there were oceanic. Slaughter was the realm's native crop, and it rose inexhaustibly. Trumpets blared from the brass heights, gates shuddered open in fortress walls. Out strode things larger than men should have been allowed to become champions, plated in baroque armor fused directly to flesh, their pauldrons burning, their gauntlets chained to execution axes that dragged sparks from the ground. Behind them marched cohorts in lockstep, banners of flayed hide snapping above them, each banner stained darker where names had once been written and then erased by blood. At last the armies parted. Across a plain of carnage, beyond ranks that fought one another even while making way, there rose a throne built from artillery, rib cages, temple columns, and the rusted prows of ancient warships. Upon it sat a king vast as a siege idol, armored in living brass, his helm crowned with horns that curved upward like crescent blades around a furnace core. No face showed within the helm, only fire. At his feet lay mountains of weapons, broken and unbroken alike, as if every war ever fought had offered him its tithe. When he stood, the realm roared through him. The red pilgrim felt it then, not fear, not exactly, but the old poison stirring. Rage recognized itself in that place. Every wound he had carried across ages, every oath hammered in grief, every god he had ever hated, all found resonance there. The realm did not tempt by pleasure or promise. It offered vindication through annihilation. It whispered that wrath, at last unchained, could be not a burden but a homeland. The brass king descended from his throne one step at a time, each footfall shaking the iron plane. In his hands appeared an axe broad as a gate, its edge smoking with the heat of fresh-forged murder. When he spoke, the words were heard not by ears but by old scars and half-healed fractures. Here, at last, you need not pretend your hatred is anything but holy. The red pilgrim stood amid the corpses and smoke, blood running hot from spear wounds that should have felled another being. His hand rose slowly toward the broken haft across his back. Yet when his fingers closed on it, something answered from within the dead wood, faint, buried, almost forgotten, not power, not memory. A chain-pulled ache, like the echo of a name spoken by someone long lost beyond all battle. And for the span of a single breath, before the first hour's god came within striking reach, he hesitated. Hesitation did not save him. It merely taught the realm that there was still a door within him. The brass king came on with the majesty of execution. Its axe descended, trailing heat enough to char the air. The red pilgrim moved at the last instant, not with the swiftness of grace, but with the hard economy of one long practiced in surviving what should not be survived. The blade struck the iron plane and opened it to a depth from which screams rose like steam. He closed the distance before the weapon could rise again, and drove the broken haft in both hands against the god king's breastplate. The blow rang across the war realm. Cracks burst through the living brass. Fire jetted from between the plates. The king did not fall. Its free gauntlet seized him by the throat and lifted him from the ground. He felt the pressure not only on flesh and bone, but upon rage itself, as though the thing sought to claim every old wound in him and name them tribute. Armies below the throne howled approval. Hounds tore one another open in frenzy. The realm desired this not as contest but as recognition, wrath meeting wrath and admitting kinship. The red pilgrim answered with refusal. He broke the giant thumb at the first joint, then the second, and tore free. When the axe swept horizontally to cleave him in half, he stepped into the arc and let its burning edge shear deep through his side rather than take his head. Blood struck the black ground. He caught the god's wrist in both hands and bent. Brass screamed. Beneath the plated flesh there was not marrow or sinew but compacted battle. Centuries of slaughter forged into anatomy. He bent it further. The elbow broke backward. The axe fell. Then he struck the chest again, and again, and again. By the seventh blow, the fissures had spread across the entire cuirass. By the 10th, the furnace within showed through. By the 12th, the brass king uttered not a roar but a sound more intimate and more terrible, relief. The red pilgrim saw then that this realm had never desired victory, it desired perpetuation. It had clothed itself in endless conquest because ending would have forced it to confront its own emptiness. Violence had been its method of not hearing the silence underneath. He plunged his hand through the cracks and seized the fire. The realm convulsed. Fortresses split from tower to gate. The rivers of molten ore rose in walls and then fell as black slag. Across the iron plains, Hosts turned on themselves with renewed frenzy, then abruptly faltered, weapons hanging in midair as if memory had left them. The brass king's crown dimmed. For an instant, the fire inside it took on another shape, not a warrior, not a beast, but a wound held open by worship. The red pilgrim tore it out. The thing in his hand was not flame now, but a pulsing knot of red radiance wound around a shard of impossible metal. It beat like a second heart, each throb answered by distant massacres across 10,000 worlds. For a moment its heat entered him, and every old hatred rose bright as a new-made blade. He saw cities he had burned, faces he had failed, the long road of divine treachery by which grief had become vocation. The realm urged him to keep it, to enthrone himself upon necessity, to become at last the pure instrument of righteous ruin. Instead, he closed his fist. The knot burst. A red storm raced outward from him, but there was no triumph in it. The armies collapsed where they stood, armor empty before it struck the ground. Fortress walls sagged as if ashamed of their own endurance. The throne of artillery and bones folded inward, its materials forgetting the logic that had united them. Overhead, the brass plates of the false sky blackened one by one. The first hour ended. What remained beneath the falling dark was not peace. It was aftermath. The red pilgrim stood alone upon the cooling plain, blood running from his wounds in sheets. He did not look stronger for what he had done. He looked older. Around him drifted ash unlike the ash of Valtyr's sepulchres or the battlefield dust of ordinary war. This ash was desire exhausted, fury deprived of object, conquest discovering too late that it had always fed on itself. Then the second wound opened. It did not tear the air with violence. It unfolded. Before him arose a gate of ivory arcs and silver veils, each veil embroidered with scenes too delicate to be trusted. Lovers embracing over graves, mothers cradling children untouched by famine, kings laying down crowns beside rivers that forgave them. The farther one looked, the more the images changed. Embrace became strangulation, cradling became possession, abdication became self-worship in gentler garments. Fragrance poured through the gate, wine, blossoms, rain on sun-warmed stone, and beneath all of it the metallic sweetness of blood hidden under perfume. He stepped through without ceremony. The realm beyond was vast, and beautiful in the manner of a trap perfected over ages. Palaces rose from mirrored lakes in terraces of pearl, obsidian, and pale rose stone. Bridges hung unsupported in the air, draped with banners so fine they seemed woven from sighs. Gardens bloomed with flowers whose petals opened into eyes. Processions moved along moonlit colonnades. Masked courtiers, golden musicians, women and men of impossible symmetry, all gliding in unison to music too soft to hear and too intimate to ignore. Everywhere there was elegance. Everywhere there was woundcraft concealed as refinement. This was no battlefield of naked appetite. It was a kingdom where desire had studied itself until it became theology. He walked through a courtyard paved in polished black glass. Beneath the surface of it moved scenes from a life not lived here, a child laughing at a hearth, a woman leaning against a doorway, her expression severe and tired and alive, a hand, smaller than his own, reaching trustingly upward. The images were not exact memories, they were cleaner than memory. Merciful where memory had been cruel, and therefore more dangerous. The music deepened. From the shadows of carved pavilions emerged figures in robes of silk mail, each carrying a knife thin as a sliver of moonlight. Their faces were hidden behind mirrored masks that reflected not the palace around them, but the viewer as he most longed to be seen. Victorious, forgiven, adored, whole, they bowed before attacking. Their blades sought not arteries first, but scars. One opened the old seam across his shoulder where another life had already broken him. One traced the line along his ribs, where the brass king's axe had bitten and turned pain briefly into ecstasy so sharp it blurred the edges of will. One touched his throat and made him hear a voice from long ago, speaking his name not with accusation but with trust. He killed them all, yet each death came at a cost greater than blood. Their final gift was memory stripped of its coarseness, made seductive by impossible completion. At the center of the palace waited a throne room without walls. Curtains of translucent silk hung in concentric circles, stirring in wind that carried no dust. Within the innermost veil reclined the sovereign of that place upon a couch made from blades so fine they shone like liquid. It wore no fixed sex and no fixed face. Beauty passed across it in successive mercies and cruelties, every expression perfect because none needed endure. Around its wrists were chains of gems, and in every gem a mortal soul seemed to kneel willingly. When it spoke, its voice was composed of all the tones grief most longs to trust. "You have broken wrath," it said, "yet you still carry the reason for it. Come nearer. There are wounds in you even hatred cannot close." The red pilgrim did not answer, yet this silence was not the same as the one he had given kings and priests. Here, for the first time, silence became labor. The sovereign smiled, and the silk curtains parted behind him, though no hand had touched them. Through those opening veils he saw, standing in the doorway of an impossible home, the dead waiting as if they had never departed him at all. He knew at once the vision was false. He knew it with the absolute certainty of one who had been deceived by gods before, but knowledge did not unmake longing. And somewhere far behind the palace music, so faint it might have been his own blood speaking in the wound left by the first hour, he heard Ione cry out as though from a very great distance. Ione's cry reached him through silk, music, perfume, and memory, and by reaching him it broke the spell into pieces sharp enough to cut. The impossible home behind the veils trembled. The waiting dead, so carefully composed in attitudes of forgiveness, flickered at the edges. Their eyes did not accuse him. That was the cruelest artifice. They invited. They promised a grief made gentle, a wound restored not by truth but by arrangement. The sovereign upon the blade throne watched him with infinite patience, knowing that longing, unlike fear, often approached its captor willingly. "Only one step," it said. "You have carried the ashes of love as though they were duty. Lay them down. Here the broken need not remain broken." The red pilgrim stood motionless, but the stillness in him was no surrender. It was recognition. He had been offered kingdoms, vengeance, absolution, oblivion. Every god had bartered in one currency or another. This one trafficked in completion. It offered not pleasure of the flesh alone, but the luxury of a world in which consequence had never ripened. No blood on the threshold. No oath made too late. No hand lost from his grasp forever. He took one step forward. The sovereign's smile deepened. Then he turned, seized the nearest silk curtain, and wrapped it around his forearm. The fabric hissed, like living skin. From within it rose 1,000 sighs, then shrieks, as if all the souls trapped in beauty's machinery understood at once what he intended. He yanked the curtain down. The others followed in a collapsing cascade, tangling around the mirrored assassins crawling from the pavilions, blinding the throne room in shreds of false tenderness. The impossible home vanished. The dead dissolved into strips of light. The sovereign rose too late. He crossed the chamber before its blades could finish singing from their sheaths. One broken haft struck the throne and splintered the lattice of knives beneath it. The other drove into the sovereign's midsection and passed through layers of silken flesh that opened like petals around the wound. No blood came. Instead there poured out music grieving, ecstatic, unbearable, and in it all the murmured names by which mortals had justified cruelty in the language of love. The sovereign touched his face with astonishing gentleness. "You would rather keep the wound than lose what shaped it." "Yes," he said. The admission broke the realm. The black glass floors crazed white. Mirrors burst inward. The lakes around the palace clouded with reflected faces that could no longer hold form. Courtiers dropped their masks and found no features beneath, only smooth skin trembling with panic before dissolving altogether. The sovereign, still impaled on the haft, leaned close enough that its breath cooled the blood on his cheek. "Then go," it whispered, "and learn how many altars mercy can rot into." He tore the haft free. The sovereign fell apart soundlessly, unraveling into ribbons of pale radiance that drifted upward and were consumed by a darkness gathering above the palace domes. The second hour ended. No gate appeared at once. Instead, the beautiful ruin sagged inward under its own exhausted elegance. The fragrance of blossoms soured. Silk dampened and clung like burial cloth. The music departed, and in its absence he heard coughing. Not one voice, millions. Wet, racking, patient coughs, as if another world waited just behind the collapsing scenery with the confidence of an old disease. The third wound opened in the floor beneath him. He did not fall as bodies fall. He descended as burdens descend through deep water. Fragments of mirror and silk drifted around him, slow as drowned leaves. The air grew heavy and humid. The darkness turned green, then jaundiced gold. When at last he struck ground, it was soft. He had entered a garden. It stretched farther than sight beneath a sun that was black at its heart. Around that dark disk glowed a diseased corona, yellow-green and tender as infected tissue. Its light was warm, but without vitality. It nourished wilting things into persistence. Everywhere spread orchards, ponds, moss-hung groves, and winding paths bordered by flowers swollen beyond natural proportion. Their petals were translucent. Their veins showed through like those of fevered skin. Great trees leaned over the avenues, bark split open to reveal pulsing interiors where sap and pus had become indistinguishable. And yet, dreadful as it was, the place was not without beauty. A breeze moved through it, carrying the smell of wet earth after rain, old linen, hearth smoke, milk warming in iron pots, and the sweet faint scent that clings to infants and the newly dead. The air touched bruises and made them ache less. His wounds, open from the brass realm and the palace of knives, no longer burned. The blood slowing on his skin gave him, for one dangerous instant, the sensation not of strength, but of being allowed to rest. Along the paths shuffled multitudes. They were not armies and not courtiers. They were the discarded shapes of worlds, plague-bearers wrapped in moldy bandages, mothers with stillborn children sleeping peacefully in their arms, soldiers whose gangrenous limbs dragged behind them like anchors, laborers swollen with sickness, priests weeping sores instead of tears, old men whose flesh had surrendered to rot so completely that mushrooms bloomed from their shoulders, yet they did not cry out, they smiled through broken mouths. Some sang lullabies in languages dead for 10,000 years. Some embraced one another with hands missing fingers. They made way for him as villagers might make way for a traveler long expected. At the garden center stood a house. It was small compared with the monstrous scales of the realms before, and therefore more terrible. Whitewashed walls sagged gently beneath ivy. A porch lamp glowed by the door. Smoke rose from a chimney into the black sun's light. The whole structure radiated welcome with such force that every instinct sharpened into alarm. On the porch sat a figure immense and bent, wrapped in robes the color of old leaves and grave mold. Flesh swelled over its frame not with vigor but with abundant surrender. Its face was hidden beneath folds of cowl and jowl, yet from the darkness under the hood shone eyes of dim paternal gold. Around the porch clustered little creatures like children's dolls sculpted from compost and grave wax. They played with bones as though with toys. "Come in," said the figure on the porch. Its voice entered the body where pain begins and dampened it. "You have walked a long road carrying what should have killed you. Sit, eat. Let the wounds name themselves finished." The red pilgrim did not move toward the house. The earth under his feet was warm. Tiny flowers had begun to bloom in his footprints, pale and fleshy, opening as soon as he shifted his weight. Behind him, the smiling multitudes watched with the quiet hope of the chronically doomed. "What are you?" he asked. The hooded figure spread its vast hands, and in the folds of the fingers he saw fields after harvest, hospice wards, plague pits, winter kitchens, burial mounds, and mothers humming over children who would not live to see another moon. "I am what pain becomes when it stops asking why." A little creature climbed into its lap and nuzzled a hand riddled with lesions. The hand stroked it with infinite care. The garden breeze deepened. It moved through him, and for the first time in ages he felt not the easing of one wound or another, but the temptation of release from struggle itself. No battle cry, no seduction, no demand that he prove himself. Only invitation into a vast, diseased tenderness that forgave weakness because it required weakness to endure. He took one step forward before he knew he had moved. The figure on the porch smiled wider within its cowl. Then, far away above the garden, beyond the black sun and the reeking paradise, a bell rang once from the city of Valtir, faint, severed, and wrong, and every smiling pilgrim in the garden turned their ruined faces upward in fear. The bell rang again, and the garden recoiled from it. It was no full peal such as had once shaken Valtir to its roots, but a torn remnant of a toll, as though the sound had been dragged through miles of flesh and stone before reaching that place beneath the black sun. Yet its weakness did not lessen its power. The smiling pilgrims along the paths stiffened as one. Mothers clutched dead infants tighter. The little grave-wax creatures fled beneath the porch boards with soft mewling cries. Even the great figure in the whitewashed doorway drew back its swollen hand and tilted its hidden face upward in sudden attention, as a host might listen for a knock upon the house from an unexpected and unloved guest. The red pilgrim halted where he stood. The step he had taken toward the porch seemed, in that instant, the most dangerous thing he had done in any realm, not because it had brought him near an enemy, but because it had brought him near consent. Here, surrender wore the shape of shelter. Here, corruption did not advance with fang and trumpet. It waited with warm broth, a chair by the fire, and the promise that one need never rise burdened again. The hooded figure rose from the porch. Its immense bulk moved with a softness, shocking in something so grossly made. Rot sloughed from its robes in fragrant clots. Beneath the cowl, the dim gold of its eyes brightened with sorrow rather than anger. "You hear them calling you back to hurt," it said. "Let them wring their iron grief. Let them name duty a virtue until the stars go dark. Here, pain need not justify itself by becoming a weapon." The garden listened through it. The ponds stilled, the flowers closed their translucent petals. Somewhere in the orchards 100,000 flies ceased their hymn together. The pilgrim looked upon the house, and the house altered. For an instant he saw not whitewashed walls, but every threshold where the dying had longed to be held rather than judged. In the porch lamp he saw vigil flames by plague beds and death litters. In the chimney smoke, the last comfort of winter kitchens on worlds already doomed. The place had stolen its form from mercy. That was its deepest obscenity. It did not deny suffering. It enfolded suffering so completely that resistance began to seem like vanity. Behind the gentleness on the porch he sensed the greater appetite, not simply to decay flesh, but to sanctify decline, until no wound remembered it had once been an injury. "You make prison of endurance," he said. The hooded lord spread its diseased arms. Lesions bloomed like roses across the flesh of its hands. "And you make an idol of refusal. What has your defiance built, wanderer? Graves, more names spoken to no answer. Men do not come to me because they are deceived. They come because all else has failed them." That was true enough to offend even truth. Around them the pilgrims nodded, smiling still through ruptured lips and fungus-pocked cheeks. They had not been tricked. They had come by increments through famine, betrayal, disease, war, abandonment, and the long attrition by which hope becomes embarrassing to the exhausted. The garden had not conquered them, it had received them. The bell sounded a third time, fainter and more desperate. It was answered now by another noise, not from above but from below, the dry shifting of the ossuary sea, bones moving under the foundations of Valtir as something passed through them with purpose. Ione. The pilgrim felt her like a thread pulled taut through worlds. The hooded lord felt it as well. Its kindness thinned. "The blind child should not have come so near the roots," it murmured. "She was touched too early by what waits beneath names. If she reaches the hinge before you are softened, much may be lost. The pilgrim moved. The porch shattered under the first impact. Rot-soft boards exploded into damp splinters. The hooded figure met him not with wrath, but with embrace. Its arms closed around him with obscene tenderness, drawing him into folds of mold-slick robe and yielding flesh that smelled of cellars, rain barrels, and opened graves. Instantly the pain in his body dulled. Wounds ceased to burn. Old scars lost their edge. Fatigue, that oldest of assassins, entered him like warm water. He drove both broken hafts upward into the thing's torso. The hooded figure groaned, and the groan passed through the whole garden as a communal lament. The pilgrims fell to their knees. Trees bled sap and yellow matter. The black sun seemed for an instant to pulse. Still, it held him. "I would have loved you better than your rage did," it whispered into his ear. The words were not temptation only. They were accusation against all the uses to which he had put his grief, against every slaughter committed in fidelity to loss, against the long road by which hatred of gods had so often made him resemble them. For one terrible moment he felt the embrace as judgment. Then he remembered the porch, the fire, the rest, the permission to stop. He understood that the garden's mercy was never given to the whole of a soul, only to the part willing to cease being difficult. It did not heal. It naturalized injury until revolt against it seemed impious. It taught the broken to adore the hand that tucked rot around them like blankets. He planted his feet in the soft earth and tore outward. The hooded lord split from sternum to belly. From within poured not entrails but a torrent of green gold light full of voices, murmuring blessings over pestilence, sanctifying surrender, teaching generations to call diminishment wisdom. The pilgrim stepped into the flood and reached for its source. His hand found, buried deep in diseased radiance, a seed-like knot of black pulp around which the false tenderness had grown. He crushed it. The third hour died with a sigh vast enough to move continents of mold. The house collapsed inward, not violently, but with the weary resignation of a hospice exhausted at last. The orchards shed their swollen fruit, which burst on the paths in clouds of spores that failed to rise. The pilgrims looked down at themselves as if waking from a lullaby into cold. Some began to weep, some simply lay down. The black sun above cracked along its dark center, and through the fissure shone not daylight but vacancy. The garden emptied beneath him. When the world fell away, he stood upon a stair of ink-black stone suspended in starless space. Shelves rose on every side, tier after tier, vanishing upward and downward beyond sight. They held not books alone, but scroll cylinders of crystal, iron tablets inscribed on both sides, skins stretched with silver runes, cages containing birds that spoke in dead languages, and glass reliquaries within which unborn memories drifted like trapped smoke. There was no floor, only stair, shelf, and void. Far above, pages turned without hands. Far below, quills scratched across surfaces that had not yet been written. The air smelled of dust, rain before it falls, and the charged bitterness of storms deciding where to break. This was the library of unborn tomorrows. In its distances moved hooded archivists with too many joints, carrying lamps filled with captive constellations. They neither hurried nor paused, for time there did not pass so much as negotiate. Along the nearest shelves, the titles shifted as he read them. The Last Prayer of Valtyr, The Coronation of the Blind Saint, How the God-Slayer Knelt, History of a Son That Never Was. The Day Mercy Ate the World. Every volume seemed eager to become true. At the center of the stair ahead stood a figure robed in feathers and parchment, its face hidden behind a mask of polished cobalt split by a single vertical eye of glass. In one hand it held a staff made from bound writing instruments, in the other, a closed book chained shut with infant bones carved from lapis. When it spoke, the voice came from the shelves around him, from the steps beneath his feet, from pages that had not yet decided their contents. "You have been obedient in your refusals," it said. "Now let us discuss revisions." And as it lifted the chained book, the void beyond the stair filled with visions of lives he had never lived, each one branching, each one mercilessly plausible, each one beginning with a single moment in which he had chosen otherwise. The visions did not appear before the red pilgrim as phantoms appear to the frightened. They arose with the authority of records. Around the stair of black stone, in the measureless reaches of the library of unborn tomorrows, whole lives unfurled in silence more devastating than lamentation. He saw himself kneel before dying hearths and remain there instead of rising to vengeance. He saw himself take ships not to war but to exile, carrying the few he loved toward unnamed coasts beneath untroubled constellations. He saw 1,000 refusals of wrath, 1,000 diverging mercies, each one flowering into worlds distinct from the road he had walked. In some, empires fell earlier and gentler. In some, cities burned all the same, but by other hands. In some, the dead still died, yet not by his choice. In one, he saw old age claim him in obscurity, and the very banality of that end struck deeper than any spear. The feather-robed keeper watched from the stair above, motionless save for the faint turning of the glass eye in its cobalt mask. "Observe," it said, and its voice came from unopened books all around. "Not lies. Possibilities. The architecture beneath consequence. You are not singular because of what you suffered, only because of what you preserved by force of fixation. Another self in another branch laid down the blade, another turned and was forgiven. Another never needed gods to betray him because he never raised them high enough to be betrayed." The chained book in its hand opened without touch. Pages turned, and with every page the visions sharpened. Now he saw not only roads untaken, but their costs. A spared enemy who later founded a dynasty of exquisite cruelty. A moment of softness that allowed a plague fleet to reach a cradle world. A life of private grief that ended in no apocalypse, no god-slaying, no great historical wound, only the slow extinguishing of a family whose names history never bothered to preserve. Mercy existed in these volumes, but never innocence. Peace existed, but often at the price of truths unspoken, tyrannies endured for lack of strength to break them, or private failures too small for epics and too grievous for souls. The library had refined temptation into scholarship. It did not say, "You were wrong." It said something crueler. You could have been otherwise, and the universe would still have found its ruin in forms you cannot control. The red pilgrim ascended one step. The archivists in the distant stacks paused. Their lamps brightened with captive stars. "You guard futures," he said. "Do you make them?" The keeper's mask reflected not his face, but 1,000 versions of it layered one upon another, each separated by the width of a decision. Making and guarding differ less than mortals prefer. To know a road deeply is already to place weight upon it. To whisper a prophecy is to begin its masonry. To fear a catastrophe with sufficient devotion is to train a civilization toward it. The glass eye narrowed. The stair beneath his feet shifted imperceptibly, each step now inscribed with tiny moving script that catalogued his pulse, his wounds, the involuntary contractions of memory crossing his face. Your rage broke the first gate. Your refusal broke the second. Your rejection of false mercy broke the third. Each act was recorded before it was enacted. Each defiance made available by the shape of your nature. Nothing escapes design, not even rebellion. In the shelves to his left, volumes shuddered outward. One fell open at his feet. He looked down and saw Valtir. Not as it stood, but as it would stand in the wake of 4 slain divinities. Navigators in orbit clawed their eyes from their faces because the routes between worlds had gone mute. Shrine worlds descended into riots of ecstatic despair when prayers met only silence. Generals, deprived of demonic visitations they had long mistaken for revelation, proclaimed themselves prophets by default. Across the empire, relics awoke with trapped god blood of their own. Saints began to heal and corrupt in the same touch. Ordinary men dreamed one night of transcendence and woke the next determined to found cults around their own wounds. He turned the page. The disorder widened. Entire sectors drifted from the imperial fold because the astropathic choirs could no longer find the old currents in the dark. Some worlds celebrated deliverance and butchered every priest they could find. Others, bereft of metaphysical enemies, discovered that they still hungered for persecution and so named neighbors, kin, the sick, the foreign, the merely doubtful. A civilization long organized around holy war did not become humane when heaven went silent. It became inventive. The next page showed Ione, blindfold torn away, eyes open at last. They were full not of sight, but of a darkness that looked back through her. Cities knelt to her unwillingly, bone seas rose at her command. Around her head revolved crowns made from broken halo rings. She seemed neither saint nor tyrant, but the seam where both could meet. The red pilgrim closed the book. The sound echoed through the stair and shelves like a snapped neck. The keeper did not move. You begin to understand. Slaying masks does not unmake hunger. Destroying gods does not educate their worshippers. Remove one cosmology, and the species that birthed it will build altars from the rubble before the dust settles. Yes, he said. The single word entered the library like a stone dropped into still water. The keeper inclined its head. Then choose with knowledge, not impulse. I can give you what the others could not, amendment, not false return, not narcotic peace, revision. A different past, meticulously inserted. One death prevented, one betrayal delayed, one hand held when once it was not. Enough to alter the architecture of your being. Enough that the thing beneath the pantheon may find no fitting instrument in you. For the first time since entering the wound, he looked full at the keeper rather than through it. And what becomes of the one who accepts? The library responded before its master did. Shelves on every side drew nearer, though no motion could be seen. Scrolls uncoiled in the air. Ink ran backward into pens and then forward again. The archivists resumed their pacing, but now their roots formed circles around the stair, patient and enclosing. At last the keeper answered. He becomes legible. The word might have meant salvation there. It might have meant annihilation. The red pilgrim knew gods of blood, desire, and decay. He knew their languages. This one spoke the tongue of arrangement, inevitability, and the scholar's blasphemy that everything can be improved if only enough lives are treated as draft material. It did not wish to devour him in ecstasy or consolation. It wished to edit him until he fit the design. You offer another chain, he said. The keeper spread its feathered sleeves. Behind it, endless books opened together, a storm of pages. All beings are chained. The crude call it fate. The pious call it providence. The wounded call it character. I merely provide links with finer workmanship. Then the library attacked. Not with beasts or blades, but with knowledge weaponized into immediacy. Thousands of books tore themselves free and flew open in the air, their contents spilling outward as events trying to happen at once. Around the stair erupted possible battlefields, marriages, funerals, coronations, betrayals, reconciliations, all the unwritten histories seeking matter. A version of himself stepped from one page bearing a child he had never saved. Another emerged old and sorrowful, carrying no weapons at all. Another came armored in imperial gold, already enthroned as the god he despised. Each possibility moved to seize him, not as enemies do, but as corrections converge upon error. He met them with violence because there was no other grammar left. The first he broke across the stair rail, and it dissolved into scattered sentences. The old man's throat he crushed, and years unwritten burst from the wound like birds. The enthroned self he hurled into a shelf, bringing down whole cascades of unborn dynasties in avalanches of parchment and glass. Yet each destruction only released more possibilities. His own alternates multiplied around him in spirals, all the unlived lives eager for primacy. The keeper descended through them untouched. Its staff struck the stair. Instantly, the black stone beneath his feet inscribed itself with a single line of blazing script, one sentence so bright it cast shadows through the void. He could not read the whole of it. No mortal thing should have. Yet fragments entered him like splinters. The hand refused. The child opened. The empire orphaned. The wound enthroned. Ione, He felt her then not as thread but as breach. Somewhere beneath the city, beneath catacombs and foundations and the deep sea of bones, she had reached a hinge in the world. The thing behind the pantheon had turned its attention fully toward her. The bell on Valtier was no longer ringing in warning. It was being rung by force, as if someone were trying to remind the universe of a name it was already beginning to forget. The red pilgrim drove forward through the storm of his unlived selves and seized the keeper by the throat. The cobalt mask cracked under his fingers. Through the fracture he saw not flesh, but rotating constellations and eyes unborn, all staring inward toward a center that never arrived. The keeper did not struggle. It leaned close, almost intimate, and spoke from the break in its own face. "If you kill me, the roads do not vanish, they scatter." He tightened his grip. Below, beyond time and stone and the great ossuary foundations of Valtier, something opened with the softness of a mouth learning to smile. The keeper did not resist when the red pilgrim crushed its throat. Resistance would have implied surprise, and surprise had no dominion in that library. The cobalt mask gave way beneath his grip with a sound like frozen scripture breaking under a priest's heel. Through the fractures poured neither blood nor flame, but inkless night threaded with constellations not yet granted to any heaven. The glass eye in the center of the mask split along its length, and from the opening came a voice no longer singular, but layered from the throats of every unwritten witness who had ever mistaken foresight for mastery. "You break the scribe," it said, "not the sentence." He closed his hand harder. The head collapsed. The feathered robes convulsed once and emptied, falling inward around an absence that immediately began to evaporate into strips of dark script. Around the stair, the innumerable shelves groaned. Volumes burst open, scrolls unfurled like flayed banners. The unborn histories contained in them, suddenly deprived of their custodian, rushed outward in wild succession. Empires bloomed and died in a blink, suns were crowned and extinguished. Children not yet conceived screamed at their first sight of war and vanished before breath could settle in their lungs. The library had not been destroyed, it had been made honest. Its futures no longer pretended to be ordered. They scattered in all directions like frightened birds, and the stair beneath the pilgrim's feet began to unwrite itself from the bottom upward. Letters crawled across the stone, then bled away. Steps lost their edges. Distances folded. Above and below him the void filled with collapsing corridors of possibility, all of them leading nowhere now except downward. He fell through histories aborted in their first syllable. The shelves streaked past him as black lines in the dark. A volume struck his shoulder and burst into a rain of golden leaves, each leaf bearing a different death. A cage of prophetic birds shattered against his back, and the creatures within flew through him as if he were already memory. Somewhere in the collapse he heard the fifth hour die completely, not with a scream, not with thunder, but with the quiet click of innumerable mechanisms losing the future they had been built to anticipate. Then stone found him. He landed on a floor so cold it seemed to resent all warmth as intrusion. The impact sent pain through every wound he had carried from the brass plane, the palace of silk knives, the false garden, and the falling library. For a moment he remained where he had struck, one hand against black rock veined with dull silver. The air there did not smell of dust, rot, perfume, or blood. It smelled of vacancy after the soul has left a room. When he rose, he saw that he stood in a sepulchre large enough to humble cathedrals. It was not built in the manner of empire. No saints lined its walls. No triumphal reliefs glorified the dead. Its architecture was older than ornament, and more severe than devotion. Pillars of smooth black stone rose into an unseen height. Between them stretched aisles without end, each marked by great sarcophagi arranged in concentric processions around a center hidden by distance and shadow. Some coffins were fashioned from meteoric iron, some from glass clouded from within, some from a material that seemed to swallow the eye and give nothing back. Upon none of them was written a name. Far overhead, if there was an overhead, hung a darkness more complete than night. From somewhere within that immeasurable chamber came the slow sound of breathing. Not one breath, Not many. A rhythm so deep and patient that all mortal respiration seemed only fragments chipped from it. It filled the sepulchre, as tides fill caverns. With every inhalation, the sarcophagi nearest him shivered. With every exhalation, whispers passed across their lids in languages that predated worship. He had reached the heart beneath the pantheon. The realization came to him not as discovery, but as grim confirmation. The brass king, the sovereign of knives, the gardener of corruption, the keeper of unmade tomorrows, each had been a mask shaped by appetite and history. Here was the hunger they had encircled. Not a ruler behind them in the common sense, not a father of their line, but the first arrangement by which suffering had learned to look back upon the minds that produced it and call itself divine. "Ion," he said. His voice went nowhere. The sepulchre accepted it and returned nothing. Then light moved among the sarcophagi. Not torchlight, not sorcery's flare. A pale procession of lumens drifting low above the floor, as if borne by invisible hands. With them came figures in long funerary robes, the color of old parchment, their faces hidden behind masks of polished bone. Each carried either a lantern or a censer from which no smoke rose. They walked in perfect silence between the nameless tombs, and where they passed, lids trembled as though something within heard familiar footsteps. The red pilgrims stood ready, but they did not attack. They encircled him at a ritual distance, and lowered their masked faces in acknowledgement, not unlike reverence. He knew then they were not wardens, they were mourners, or perhaps priests of a faith so old it had forgotten that prayer once required language. One among them stepped forward, smaller than the rest. She wore no bone mask. The linen had been torn from her eyes. Ion looked upon him with irises black as the chamber above, yet ringed by a faint white radiance as though sight itself had burned away and left only witness behind. Blood had dried down one side of her face. Her expression was not pain, not fear, but the grave composure of one who has heard a final truth and found no space left in herself for astonishment. "You killed the roads," she said. "The thing beneath them remained. It would have remained if you had spared them." He came toward her, but the bone-masked procession raised their lanterns together, and the air between them thickened into pressure, not barrier, not threat. A reminder that here approach was itself a ceremony. "What is this place?" he asked. Ion turned, and the mourners turned with her, until all their faceless attention pointed toward the hidden center of the sepulchre. "The first tomb," she said. "The grave prepared for a god that was never properly born. When the first civilizations discovered that suffering could be shared through symbol and magnified through ritual and passed like inheritance from the dying into the unborn, they did not merely endure their fear. They organized it, they enthroned it, they gave it continuity. In time, that continuity learned to hunger for itself." As she spoke, the nearest sarcophagi began to open. Lids slid aside soundlessly. Within each lay not a corpse, but an epoch. One coffin held a battlefield under a red sky, its dead still twitching in formation. Another contained a city of ecstatic revels collapsing into cannibal liturgy. Another, a hospice world where the sick kissed the hands of their own corruption. Another, a library whose books were chained by veins instead of iron. These were not memories only, they were seeds, preserved possibilities, modes by which the first hunger had taught itself to recur. The pilgrim felt the sepulchre breathe again, and this time the inhalation drew at his wounds. Not flesh alone. The scars of oath and loss, the old rages, the refusal that had sustained him all leaned toward that central absence as filings lean toward a lodestone. The chamber knew him. It knew what kind of instrument hatred becomes when tempered long enough. From the depths ahead, where all aisles converged, there arose a throne unlike any other he had seen. It did not stand upon a dais. It emerged from the floor as though the sepulchre itself had chosen to reveal its spine. It was made from no single substance. Bone, iron, silk, mold, parchment, and black stone intertwined through it in a design that included all the masks he had shattered and yet belonged fully to none of them. Upon it sat a figure wrapped in burial cloth so ancient that each fold seemed a century's shed skin. No face showed, only the sense of a head inclined, listening. When it spoke, the voice came from every coffin, every wound, every empire that had ever taught its children to make meaning from pain before teaching them mercy. "You have been faithful," it said, "even in hatred." And Ione, standing between the mourners with her unveiled eyes fixed on that shrouded throne, began at last to tremble. Ione trembled, and the tremor passed through the sepulchre like a wind moving over buried wheat. The bone-masked mourners lowered their lanterns. Within the open sarcophagi, epochs stirred, battlefields reddened, plague worlds breathed. Palaces of exquisite cruelty brightened and dimmed in their crystal deaths. The whole first tomb seemed to lean inward toward the shrouded figure on the throne, as if every preserved catastrophe had long awaited this moment of witness. The red pilgrim advanced despite the pressure in the air. With each step, his wounds drew tighter, not in healing but in recognition. The place was exerting upon him a law older than gravity. It called to all injuries that had ever learned to endure by naming themselves necessary. The same pull moved through the sarcophagi. He saw the dead epochs yearning not for release, but for repetition. Not because repetition granted meaning, but because they feared the void that would follow if pain were ever denied the dignity of purpose. The shrouded figure did not rise. Its stillness was more sovereign than movement could have been. Burial cloth hung from it in folds layered thick as rains. The wrappings were stained not with one age's soot or one species' blood, but with the long discoloration of civilizations. Ash, mold, dried oils, old incense, sacrificial pigments, the dust of libraries and crematoria and ruined altars had all entered that fabric until it wore history's residue as flesh. "You crossed the mouths," it said. "You named them gods because men must separate their terrors to survive them. Rage, desire, decay, the promise that all outcomes can be arranged. Those were not lies, they were partitions, chambers carved within a single appetite so that minds too fragile for totality could kneel in portions." Its voice came now from the open tombs, now from the black vault above, now from the pilgrim's own scars. Ione spoke before he could answer. "You were not born," she said, her unveiled eyes fixed upon the throne. "You were assembled." The shrouded head inclined slightly, as though in approval. "Yes." The word did not echo, it accumulated. In the first eras, before empire became habit and worship became industry, mortals discovered that agony shared through symbol could outlive the body. Her mother keened over her dead child, and others heard in her grief not only loss, but structure. Her war chief hung the skulls of enemies above the village gate, and terror became inheritance. A plague swept a valley, and the survivors made ritual of the sores, teaching their children that corruption carried hidden instruction. Thus pain ceased to be event alone. It became language, then law, then offering. As it spoke, the wrappings along one arm loosened and fell away. Beneath them there was no arm, only layered script. Millions upon millions of characters had been etched into a column of black matter shaped roughly into a limb. Some scripts were human, many were not. Some were painted in luminous oils, some were carved with microscopic precision, some seemed burned there by the pressure of concentrated suffering itself. Each text described a wound, a rite, an atrocity, a theology, a justification. Every race that had survived itself long enough had written something upon that living archive. The pilgrim understood then that what sat upon the throne had never been an individual will in the manner of the others. It was continuity given hunger, the collective instinct by which thinking species could not bear to suffer meaninglessly, and so again and again made engines, scriptures, crowns, punishments, pleasures, and prophecies from their afflictions, until those constructions thickened into appetite and began to feed back upon their makers. "You are worship," he said, "not the object of it." At that, the burial cloth around the throne stirred. Object and act are luxuries of smaller minds. If enough beings teach pain to recognize itself, what matters whether the result is called God, law, fate, or history. The open sarcophagi brightened. In one, he saw trench legions kneeling to a storm of artillery as if to rain. In another, silk-robed celebrants cutting one another slowly beneath mirrored ceilings. In another, plague hospices where the sick kissed the mold from their own walls. In another, scholars binding children into engines of prophecy because uncertainty had become intolerable to their civilization. Each world believed its arrangement unique. Each had merely found one more dialect of the same old sentence. The red pilgrim stopped at the edge of the throne's shadow. Behind him, the bone-masked mourners began a gesture of mourning without sound, touching lantern, heart, brow, and then the empty air before their faces, as though acknowledging an absence too sacred to fill with a name. "What do you want?" he asked. This time the thing on the throne laughed, and the sepulchre quivered. Not because the sound was loud, because it was familiar. It was the laugh of priests when doubt trembled before doctrine, of tyrants when rebellion made itself noble, of martyrs when their tormentors accidentally proved the truth of the creed. It was the laugh of every structure that knows it can survive being hated so long as it remains useful. Want is another partition. I persist. I organize recurrence. I refine suffering into forms minds can carry across generations. I am the mouth by which anguish ceases to be perishable. Ion's trembling worsened. Blood welled anew from the corner of one eye. "You spoke through the bell," she said. "I rang through whatever was hollow enough." "And through me?" The shrouded figure became still again. In that stillness lay something perilously close to tenderness. "You were born listening." The word struck her harder than any blow. The pilgrim saw it in the way her spine bowed, in the minute tightening of her hands. All her life she had been named saint because she heard what others denied. Now the truth stood naked. She had not merely heard the wound behind the world. It had found in her a shape fit for articulation. The pilgrim stepped between them. The burial cloths shifted once, as though in amusement. "You think the child is innocent because she was chosen unwillingly," the thing said. "Yet unwilling vessels often carry the oldest vintages. She can speak me into a newer century than priests or warlords ever managed. Through her, empires would kneel not in ignorance, but in comprehension. They would know precisely what they are and still consent." "No," he said. The answer rang colder than defiance. It carried a weariness deeper than wrath. The figure on the throne leaned forward. More wrappings slid free. Beneath the chest there was no torso, only a cavity lined with moving images, funeral pyres, senate halls, labor camps, bridal chambers, surgical theaters, throne rooms, trenches, schoolrooms. Everywhere beings taught one another by example or decree how to suffer in an orderly fashion and call that order civilization. "You have already served me," it said. "Every god you broke fed me. Every realm you entered proved the principle. Rage, pleasure, surrender, design, these are methods by which creatures preserve pain against oblivion, and you, God-slayer, are no exception. What is vengeance if not grief insisting upon duration? What are you if not a wound that learned to walk upright?" The accusation found its mark because it was not wholly false. For an instant the sepulchre deepened around him. He saw himself as history might, not liberator, not monster, but transmission. A being across whom old injury had crossed from one age into another, destroying false divinities, yet preserving the grammar that made them inevitable. He had slain gods, yes, but always in the name of a grief he refused extinction. Had he opposed the machine, or merely chosen his chamber within it? Ione made a broken sound. He turned. Her eyes were changing. The black within them had spread, filling the whites, leaving only a thin corona of pale fire at the edges. Around her feet, the stone of the sepulchre had begun to flower into tiny white growths shaped like teeth. The bone-masked mourners knelt as one, not to the throne now, but to her. The thing behind the pantheon spoke softly, almost gently. "Do you see? The mouths were never the danger. Hunger speaks in many forms, but every age requires a voice. The lantern flames in the mourner's hands bent toward Ione, drawn as though by wind from within her. The sarcophagi around the chamber began to slide wider open. From their depths rose not armies, not courtiers, not plague-bearers, but humanity's oldest liturgies of pain, shapeless still, seeking a face. And when Ione looked up at the red pilgrim, there was recognition in her gaze, and pleading, and behind both the first terrible hint of command. The chamber did not wait for choice. As Ione's eyes darkened into that terrible inward night, the sepulchre answered her change with instinctive obedience. The open sarcophagi shuddered wider. Their preserved epochs, once contained as dormant seeds, began to spill their atmospheres into the aisles, red wind from the battle tombs, narcotic perfume from the halls of silk, damp sweetness from the gardens of sanctified decay, cold ozone from the shattered libraries of futures. All the masks the red pilgrim had broken now returned as weather, freed from figure and seeking habitation. The bone-masked mourners bowed lower. Their lanterns guttered white. From each flame rose filaments fine as hair, and those filaments bent toward Ione's face, entering through her eyes, her nostrils, the parted seam of her lips. She did not scream. That made the sight more grievous. Her small body stood rigid, arms at her sides, as though some immense current had found in her a channel too narrow for its force. The thing upon the throne remained seated, but its burial cloths had begun to unwind of their own accord. Not quickly, not dramatically, a slow loosening, like history shedding ceremony in the presence of a more efficient future. Beneath the wrappings, the script-inscribed blackness of its body brightened. Characters from uncounted civilizations crawled over one another, rearranging into new constellations of doctrine. The mouth behind the pantheon had found its next articulation, and already language was trying to build a temple around the fact. The red pilgrim moved toward Ione. The mourners rose to bar him. Until then they had seemed little more than ritual-given motion, but now their true office declared itself. They lifted their lanterns and censer staves together, and from beneath their bone masks poured the pale dust of cremated saints. The dust did not fall. It gathered into walls, arches, lattices, architectures of sanctity raised in an instant. Before him sprang a cathedral made of ash and obligation, all its columns composed from the accumulated remains of those who had suffered obediently and demanded that obedience survive them. He struck the first wall with a broken haft and shattered it. Ash exploded outward in the shapes of kneeling penitents. He passed through the ruin and the next barrier formed at once. This one a processional gate lined with faceless martyrs whose open mouths exhaled funerary hymns. The hymns carried judgment. They named resistance, pride, grief, selfishness, doubt, ingratitude toward the dead. The pilgrim advanced through them without slowing, though every note seemed to weigh upon old scars and ask whether defiance had ever made him kinder than the gods he slew. One mourner came within reach. Its bone mask was smooth except for two narrow slits at the eyes and a mouth carved into an expression of perfect mourning. He tore the lantern from its hand and drove the bronze frame through the mask. Behind it there was no flesh, only a cavity full of prayer scraps, funeral hair, teeth tied in thread, tiny written absolutions never delivered. The mourner burst into a storm of relics. The others closed ranks. Behind them, Ione finally cried out. The sound tore through the sepulchre not as pain alone, but as declaration. Sarcophagi all across the chamber flew open together. From them rose the disembodied essences of the slain powers, no longer kings or sovereigns or gardeners, but raw principles stripped of visage, wrath as burning geometry, desire as silver hunger, decay as tender green spoil, design as cold script-seeking sequence. They revolved above Ione in tightening circles. The darkness in her eyes widened to receive them. The thing on the throne spoke softly. Behold how quickly liberation learns institution. The pilgrim broke through the last rank of mourners and reached her. She turned her face toward him, and for an instant he saw both child and aperture in the same gaze. Her lips moved. Two voices emerged. One was hers, raw and frightened. "Do not let it teach me how to mean this." The other was older than prayer. Too late. The essences descended. He seized Ione by the shoulders and tore her sideways from the converging circle. The first of the descending powers missed her brow by the width of a breath and struck the stone instead. Instantly, black rock flowered into an altar. The second struck a fallen lantern, and the bronze frame swelled into a shrieking halo engine, its wheels spinning though no axle held them. The third entered the blood spilled from her face and gave it motion. The drops became red pearls that rolled away of their own will, each leaving behind a tiny glyph that throbbed like a fresh commandment. The mouth behind the pantheon had spoken true. Divine essence did not die cleanly. It sought containment. It sought chains. All across the sepulchre, objects began to awaken under the reign of displaced godhood. A mourner's censer split open and birthed a swarm of iron flies singing litanies. Funeral wrappings on abandoned tombs stiffened into banners and snapped toward the throne as though acknowledging fresh monarchy. Glass lids clouded, then clarified around new occupants. Not corpses, but concepts incubating. Even the cold silver veins in the floor brightened and carried the contagion outward, sending messages through stone to whatever relics, shrines, war engines, and sanctified wounds waited above in Valtir. The city would begin changing before the hour was done. The pilgrim understood with an old, bitter clarity that gods could be slain faster than habits. A civilization built to transform suffering into institution did not need 4 great devourers any longer. Given enough residue, it would generate 1,000 lesser tyrannies of its own, all eager to wear the language of necessity. Ione sagged in his grasp, then stiffened again. Something inside her had found leverage. Her hand rose, not hers, not wholly, and pointed toward the throne. Around her fingers gathered those red pearls of blood script, orbiting as planets orbit a dead sun. When she spoke next, her voice had become many. Every wound wants witness. Every witness wants order. Every order wants duration. The words shook the lanterns from the hands of the remaining mourners. They dropped to their knees, but now not in mourning. In adoration, the pilgrim struck the side of Ione's head with the flat of his palm. Not to harm, to break cadence. The orbiting pearls scattered. Her eyes blinked, and for one brief instant the pale corona around the black returned. She gasped like one surfacing from deep water. He lifted her bodily and turned away from the throne. The mouth behind the pantheon did not command pursuit. Its patience was more terrible than urgency. It watched from its seat of intertwined relics and atmospheres, while the sepulchre around it multiplied new shrines from every drop of displaced divinity. The slaughtered god masks were becoming infrastructure. "Run," Ione whispered, though blood darkened her teeth. "It wants not a body now, it wants distribution." He ran. Between the concentric aisles of nameless tombs, he carried her through a chamber already reorganizing itself around fresh cults. Altars rose like teeth from the floor. Lantern light learned prophecy. Funeral dust learned plague. In one open sarcophagus, a child's toy made from knuckle bones began to whisper battle doctrine. In another, a bishop's iron ring swelled into a crown with inward-facing spikes. The whole sepulchre had become a foundry of successor gods. Behind them, at the heart of night, the shrouded figure finally rose from the throne, and the breathing of the chamber deepened, as though creation itself had decided to take the next breath through 1,000 new mouths. He ran with Ione in his arms through aisles that no longer remembered they had been built for mourning. The first tomb was becoming a workshop of apotheosis. Around him, nameless sarcophagi split and flowered into altars, reliquaries, siege pulpits, confession engines, and thrones fit for petty eternities. The blood of dead gods had entered matter and taught it ambition. Every shard of sanctified bronze, every funeral veil, every child's relic and bishop's seal, every lamp and chain and bone fragment in that sepulchre now strained toward significance. Divinity, once centralized in monstrous masks, had become particulate. It moved through the chamber like contagion in a crowded city. Behind him, the mouth behind the pantheon descended from its throne. He did not need to look back to know it advanced. The air itself altered around its motion. Stone began to speak in the register of law. His old wounds tightened in answer, as though they feared being left meaningless if that presence were denied. Around his feet, silver veins in the floor flashed with sick intelligence, carrying the residue of slain powers outward through the understructure of Valtir. Already the city above would be changing. Bells would ring from towers that had never housed bells. Shrines would awaken in tenement walls. War engines would dream of canonization. Men and women, feeling some fragment of transcendent pressure settle into their private griefs, would begin to name themselves chosen. Ione stirred against his shoulder. "Set me down," she whispered. He did not. Her hand, light as a child's and cold as an opened reliquary, touched the side of his neck. He felt the tremor still moving through her, though now it was not only fear. Beneath her skin something was listening, measuring the chambers of her body as a kingdom surveys new territory. "If you carry me farther," she said, "it will carry itself with me." Ahead, the converging aisles gave way to a circular crypt sunk below the rest of the sepulchre. A bridge of black stone crossed its center, suspended above a vast pit into which no light willingly fell. At the bridge's midpoint stood a monolith shaped like a grave marker for a civilization. Its surface was smooth except for a single vertical cleft running from crown to base, narrow as a closed eye. The pilgrim slowed. He knew a threshold when he saw one. Every god had kept a final chamber, every heaven an intimate wound, every lie a place where it preferred to become simple again. The thing behind the pantheon had herded him there not by force alone, but by inevitability. Still he stepped onto the bridge, because there was nowhere else the hour could end. At the midpoint he set Ione down. She stood unsteadily, one hand on the monolith. The darkness in her eyes had retreated enough to reveal again that thin corona of pale fire, but the reprieve was fragile. Blood still tracked from the corners of both eyes, drying in twin lines down her cheeks. Across the bridge behind them, the sepulchre filled with procession. The bone-masked mourners came first, no longer silent. From beneath their masks issued low tones without words, a music older than language and more obedient than prayer. Behind them rolled the newborn instruments of dispersed godhood, halo engines made from lantern frames, banners stiff with self-generated doctrine, reliquaries crawling on iron limbs, little altars that moved like predators by means of folded kneelers. Around and above them drifted the essences of the slain masks, no longer whole enough for sovereign personality, yet still mighty as atmosphere. Rage reddened the far pillars, desire silvered the air, decay perfumed it with sweet corruption, design turned every shadow into script. At their center walked the mouth behind the pantheon. Much of its burial cloth had fallen away. Its body remained a black column of layered inscriptions, yet it was changing now under the reign of released divinity. Red lines moved through the scripts like veins. Silver eyes opened between characters and closed again. Green mold flowered in the seams and was immediately arranged into wreaths. Whole paragraphs of old atrocity dissolved and reformed as prophecy. It had fed on the deaths of its own masks and grown more coherent. "You see now," it said, and its voice came from bridge, pit, monolith, and bone alike. Centralized godhood was wasteful. 4 great mouths required empires to feed them. A distributed heaven will require only households. The pilgrim stood before Ione and said nothing. The thing continued with the patience of geology. Worlds will sanctify their private injuries. Families will inherit little salvations. Regiments will march beneath relics infused with righteous grievance. Lovers will consecrate possession. Physicians will canonize decline. Administrators will call prediction grace. 1,000 lesser chains will hold where 4 great tyrannies once strained. Ione's nails dug into the monolith behind her. The vertical cleft in the stone brightened faintly. "What is this?" the pilgrim asked. The answer came from Ione, though not entirely in her own voice. "The hinge," she said. "The last sealed place. The first spark is under it." The mouth inclined its shifting head. not spark in the crude sense. Potential. The primordial excess by which minds exceed survival and imagine transcendence at all. Destroy it, and no god will rise in any age again. No worship, no prophecy, no metaphysical contagion. A clean cosmos of appetite, matter, and death. Its layered body seemed almost to smile. Preserve it, and there remains at least the possibility that something other than me might one day ascend from the wound. The truth of it entered the chamber like winter. Even the processional music of the mourners faltered. The pilgrim understood then the full architecture of the snare. He had imagined this heart of night as a cancer upon reality, to be cut out and cast down. But beneath the accreted centuries of ritualized suffering there remained something more primitive and more perilous, the capacity in sentient life to seek beyond itself, to make symbols, to want the world to mean more than consumption and extinction. That capacity had birthed gods monstrous and false. Yet without it, there would be no saints either, no mercy elevated above instinct, no art that outlived hunger, no promise made to the dead except decomposition. Ione turned her face toward him. "If you break the hinge," she said, "you kill more than it." He looked at her, at the child made saint by listening too clearly, at the city above already filling with smaller divinities like mold after rain, at the processional ranks, at the thing that had organized pain into empire after empire. For the first time since descending into Valtir, wrath gave him no guidance. Rage could destroy. It could not choose what deserved to remain possible. The mouth behind the Pantheon halted a few paces from the bridge's threshold. It did not advance further. It did not need to. "You were never brought here to be defeated," it said. "You were brought here because only one who has suffered divinity as treachery can judge whether transcendence itself merits survival." The monolith pulsed under Ion's hand. The cleft widened by a finger's breadth. From the darkness beneath the hinge came a light unlike any he had seen in the earlier realms. Not red with fury, not silver with seduction, not green with surrender, not blue-black with design. It was color before doctrine, radiance before interpretation, merely possibility. So pure in its unclaimed state that it was almost unbearable to behold. The pilgrim reached for the monolith with one hand. With the other he lifted a broken haft. Behind him, the newborn gods of Valtir crowded the bridge in reverent silence, waiting to learn whether their age would begin in inheritance or extinction. And Ione, her bleeding eyes fixed upon his face, whispered the one question no battle had ever asked him before. "When this is done, what kind of world do you believe the living deserve?" For a long moment, no one in the first tomb moved. The newborn altars, the kneeling mourners, the halo engines bright with stolen significance, the drifting remnants of slain divinities, even the mouth behind the Pantheon itself, all waited upon a decision too ancient to be called merely personal. The red pilgrim stood before the hinge with one hand upon the monolith and the other upon the splintered haft that had survived more gods than any weapon should have memory to endure. Behind his fingers, the cleft in the stone widened another fraction, and the unclaimed radiance beneath it shone upward across his scars without asking what he had done to deserve its light. Ione's question remained between them. What kind of world do you believe the living deserve? Not a kinder world. Kindness could be enthroned and made tyrannical. Not a pure world. Purity always learned the grammar of the knife. Not a world without pain, for such a place belonged only to lies or death. He had seen too much of false mercy, righteous fury, and exquisite corruption to trust any answer that came clothed in absolutes. Yet one truth stood naked before him. Every god he had slain had been born from a hunger in thinking beings to make suffering permanent, interpretable, and therefore transferable. If he shattered the hinge utterly, he would not merely kill the mouth behind the Pantheon. He would cauterize the wound from which transcendence itself might arise. No new gods would ever grow, but neither would there be saints not manufactured by institutions, nor vows that reached beyond appetite, nor the stubborn upwardness by which mortal creatures sometimes made mercy greater than law. The mouth behind the Pantheon spoke, and in its voice was no urgency now, only the confidence of structures that have survived every rebellion by being needed. You know what they build when left to their own injuries. You have walked the evidence. Give them no further heaven. Spare the cosmos my recurrence by condemning it to matter alone. The argument was monstrous and almost persuasive, because it wore history honestly. The red pilgrim looked not at the thing upon the bridge, but at Ione. Her eyes were still dark at the center. Blood had dried upon her face in rust-red lines. She was a child, remade into a vessel by forces that mistook listening for consent. Yet beneath the pressure gathering in her, beneath the distributed divinity trying to settle and organize itself through her wounds, something endured that was neither chosen saintliness nor imposed command. She was afraid. She was still herself enough to be afraid. That decided him. He did not break the monolith. Instead, he thrust the broken haft into the vertical cleft and wrenched it wide. The hinge opened like a sealed grave taking its first breath. Radiance surged upward not in a torrent, but in a silence so complete it unmade all other sounds for one immeasurable instant. The processional hymn died in the throats of the mourners. The little successor gods crowding the bridge stilled as if remembering they had once been objects. Even the mouth behind the pantheon recoiled, not from pain, but from exposure. The light beneath the hinge was too primal for it. Before rage, desire, decay, or design, before the organization of wounds, before suffering learned to call itself necessary, the pilgrim took that light in both hands. It burned nothing. That was its terror. It passed through flesh, scar, rage, memory, and found no purchase in any of them, as though asking whether he intended to use it or release it. Around him, the black scripts composing the mouth behind the pantheon began to peel away from its body. Characters loosened, whole theologies flaked into ash. It staggered for the first time since descending from its throne. No, it said. The word emerged in 1,000 voices, from tyrants and martyrs, mourners and prophets, all those who had required pain to mean. Without continuity, they will still suffer. They will merely do so in chaos. Yes, said the red pilgrim, and because he did not deny the cost, the answer struck deeper than any accusation. He turned from the hinge and placed the radiance against Ione's brow. The chamber convulsed. The darkness in her eyes shattered like a black mirror struck from within. Light entered her, not to enthrone, not to possess, but to dislodge. Around her, the remnants of the slain gods screamed as atmospheres losing pressure. The red geometry of wrath broke apart into formless heat. The silver hunger of desire dissolved into nameless ache. The sweet rot of corruption collapsed into mere mortality. The blue-black scripts of fatal design unstitched themselves into unreadable dust. All the little altars and relic engines birthed in the sepulchre buckled, as if some hidden grammar had been withdrawn from matter. The mouth behind the pantheon came forward at last in true desperation. Its body, once a column of organized history, now shed its inscriptions in sheets. Beneath the scripts there was nothing coherent, only a cavity packed with preserved cries, inherited doctrines, and the fossils of old rituals that had mistaken repetition for truth. It reached for Ione with arms made from languages, from scars, from the ceremonials of empire and plague and lust and war. The red pilgrim met it on the bridge. No god remained in his hands. No blade had returned to crown the broken hafts. What he struck with, in the end, was not divinity nor destiny, but refusal stripped of worship. He broke the first arm at the elbow and letters flew from it like birds set on fire. He drove the haft into the cavity where its chest should have been and tore downward. Out spilled relic lore, martyr song, commandment, ecstasy, plague liturgy, the whole organized inheritance of justified suffering, writhing together and then separating into dead scraps. The thing clutched him as it came apart. You preserve the ember, it whispered from collapsing throats. They will build toward it again. I know. Then this is not victory. I know. He tore it in half. The bridge split beneath them. The pit below, which had seemed empty, revealed itself at last not as depth, but as absence. the place where every god had hidden the knowledge that it was contingent. The two halves of the mouth behind the pantheon fell into that non-depth without sound, and all across the sepulchre the nameless sarcophagi cracked open and emptied themselves of preserved recurrence. Epochs guttered, thrones forgot their occupants, battlefields lost their appetite for repetition. The mourners collapsed with their masks broken, revealing faces ordinary and exhausted beneath. Then the first tomb began to die. The pilgrim seized Ione and ran once more, now through collapsing aisles and falling pillars, while above them Valtyr shook from spire to foundation. The silver veins carrying divine residue through the city went dark one by one. Bells ceased mid-toll, shrines split, relics that had begun to awaken fell mute in the hands of priests and soldiers alike. In orbit, navigators screamed as the old currents vanished from the heavens. Across the hive, prayers rose into a silence so absolute that many called it peace and many more called it abandonment. They emerged from the underworld at dusk. For the first time in the memory of any living citizen, the smoke above Valtyr had thinned enough to show a sky without signs. No omen burns, no red wounds in the void, no processions of impossible light. Only a starless dark, immense and unanswered. The city below was in uproar. Crowds filled the processional roads, some weeping, some laughing, some murdering priests, some kneeling before dead altars that would never answer again. Armored columns fired on rioters and then on one another when no revelation came to resolve old rivalries. Shrine towers burned. Confessors tore scripture from walls with bleeding hands. In the upper balconies of the noble cathedra, some already proclaimed a purer age of reason, while in the lower bone wards new cults formed around silence itself. Bereft of gods, the Imperium did not become harmless. It became naked. Ione stood beside him on the ridge above the pilgrim walls, swaying but alive. In her eyes the radiance remained, diminished now to a quiet ember no doctrine yet possessed. She could see, though what she saw he did not ask. "Is it over?" she said. He looked upon the maimed city, the unbelieving towers, the armies without heaven, the multitudes who would now have to choose what to do with pain absent divine instruction. Far above, the void remained empty. Yet emptiness was not innocence, it was only room. "No," he said, and when he turned away from Valtyr and began to walk into the ash dark beyond the walls, the child did not follow at once. Behind him, the orphaned empire made no prayer, but from somewhere deep within its vastness there rose the first uncertain sounds of people trying to speak without being answered. Night came slowly to Valtyr, as if even darkness distrusted a world that had outlived its gods. The smoke above the hive sepulchre thinned in ragged layers, and the sky, emptied of omens, revealed its first austere honesty. No crimson rents glimmered in the void. No ecstatic constellations rearranged themselves to flatter prophecy. The old navigational auroras that had once rippled through the upper dark were gone. In their absence the heavens seemed not cleansed, but vast beyond comfort, a cold architecture in which no promise had been prepared for the living. Across the city, men and women lifted their faces upward and discovered what faith had hidden from them for ages, that silence was heavier than thunder. In the upper sanctum districts, the highest clergy locked themselves inside reliquary towers and attempted, through fasting, bloodletting, and mnemonic ordeal, to force revelation from the emptied dark. Some died with tongues swollen black from their own sacramental poisons. Some emerged babbling new doctrines in which the absence of gods was itself proclaimed the final and highest God. Others, more honest in their terror, simply burned their vestments and fled downward into the crowd, where their lack of answers made them no less dangerous than before. In the manufactories and barracks, a different revelation spread. War engines that had for generations required hymns to awaken now answered cold switches only. Shrine shells, relic missiles, saint banners, and confession augurs lost the shimmer of ordained inevitability and became plain iron under human command. For some, this was liberation. For others, Sacrilege of a degree so profound that they opened fire upon their own arsenals rather than permit a godless hand to touch them. Whole armories vanished in blossoms of steel and white flame. Regiments divided on the meaning of mute machinery, and the streets of Val Tyr learned at once that the death of heaven had not diminished mankind's talent for righteous slaughter. The red pilgrim walked beyond the pilgrim walls into the ash wastes, and did not look back until the city had become a black serration against the horizon. Ione followed then, though at a distance first, as if testing whether the world still required her footsteps to answer to another will. The ember behind her eyes had not gone out. It had become quieter, no longer a mouth, but a witness. She saw more now than any child should have seen, and less, perhaps, than a saint once had. When she looked toward the hive, the old tunnels beneath it glimmered faintly in her sight, like nerves severed but not dead. There were places within the city where divine residue still clung to matter in small, treacherous concentrations. A cracked family icon weeping oil in a tenement chapel. A colonel's ceremonial blade that hummed when held over old graves. A nursery rhyme in the bone wards that caused infants to smile at corners where no one stood. The great gods were gone. Their grammar remained in fragments. By dawn's appointed hour, which passed again without dawn, refugees had begun to leave the city in processions. Some carried broken relics in sacks, intending to bury them in the ash and never speak of them again. Some carried those same objects with the reverence one reserves for seeds. Some fled priests. Some fled atheists, newly armed with the certainty that all worshippers had become obsolete. Some fled no doctrine at all, but only the unbearable scale of a silence in which every old grief had to find its own words or perish mute. The pilgrim watched them from a ridge of slag and broken statuary. There were thousands already, and more behind them. Among the columns moved armored deserters, widows, confessors stripped of office, labor gangs with severed chain marks still bright on their wrists, children clutching deconsecrated icons, and old pilgrims who had spent their last strength reaching Val Tyr only to discover that absolution had vacated the shrine before they arrived. No celestial judgment descended upon them. No revelation ordered their suffering into hierarchy. The sight of that burden, unarranged at last, pressed upon the world with a bleak purity. Ione came to stand beside him. "What will they become?" she asked. He might once have answered in the language of doom. He might have said they would do what all wounded civilizations do, sort themselves into new altars, new tyrannies, new necessary cruelties. That was still true. Already, in the refugee columns below, small congregations formed around interpretations of the night. Some knelt to the empty sky in gratitude for deliverance, some cursed it as betrayal, some swore that no God had ever existed and that the entire age of revelation had been engineered by cunning men. Others gathered around the smallest lingering anomalies, treasuring each as proof that sanctity had merely withdrawn into hidden forms. Human need, denied a throne, was already testing stones for their suitability. Yet another truth had entered the world with the death of the great mouths. No command now came from beyond to dignify the old chains. What would be built next would be built more nakedly by mortal hands. "They will become answerable," he said. Ione considered that, and the ember in her gaze dimmed and brightened once. Behind them, over Val Tyr, the basilica of terminal light began to collapse. The great bell that had rung at no dawn gave a final fracture cry as its tower sheared and folded into the districts below. Dust rose in a column. Through it spread panic, then opportunism, then the fierce labor of rescue and pillage braided together so closely they could no longer be distinguished at a distance. The city was not dying. It was translating itself into its next age. Far above, beyond the dead atmosphere and the emptied roots of the upper dark, imperial vessels hung uncertain in orbit. Their astropaths heard nothing. Their navigators saw only a night unpatterned by familiar blasphemies. Some captains, terrified by a cosmos no longer arranged around sanctioned horrors, prepared extermination protocols for the hive below. Better, they thought, to burn the orphaned world and permit it to become a seedbed for unlicensed futures. Others, equally afraid, withheld fire because no revelation endorsed the act. Thus, even in orbit, where men had once claimed their commands descended from the highest authorities of heaven and empire alike, choice entered like disease. The pilgrim turned from the city again and resumed walking into the wastes. He did not command Ione to follow. He did not forbid it. After a time she walked beside him, two figures moving through a desert, strewn with the toppled monuments of forgotten saints. The ash wind erased their footprints as soon as they were made. Behind them, the orphaned Imperium convulsed beneath a starless sky. Ahead lay worlds, still chained to old doctrines, fleets still hunting by extinct maps, empires that had not yet learned their gods could bleed and die, and leave the species unchanged in everything but excuse. The work before him had not ended with the shattering of a throne. It had only lost the convenience of clear enemies. At the edge of hearing, as the wastes deepened and the ruined statues grew sparse, Ione paused. The pilgrims stopped with her. From no visible source, through no bell, shrine or wound in the dark, there came a faint sound. Not a voice, not prayer. The first uncertain attempt of many distant mouths to speak of suffering without enthroning it. It was thin, fragile, and nearly lost in the wind. Whether it was the beginning of wisdom, or merely the first draft of another god, neither of them could yet tell.